At Home Radio. Creator and presenter, Kate Jones. Music, video, produced by Jonathan, the producer.
Welcome to At Home Radio, where being at home is a state of mind and life's meaning is all around us, even in everyday conversations and encounters. I'm Kate Jones, and today's conversation is with Berenice Kleiman, author of Widowhood 101, Next Steps, which was published in January 2021. Hello, Berenice. It is so good to see you. It's always a pleasure talking with you.
Good to see you.
This is your latest book. This book is based on your own experience as a new widow after your husband Herb's passing in April 2020. You wrote much of the manuscript in the first 3 months after his death. That's a remarkable achievement in the midst of grief. Plus, you faced unexpected challenges despite having prepared in what you thought were all the proper ways. So one of my big questions is, what are some of the huge lessons you learned in this process? And I know there was a lot about, that you had a big motivation for writing this book because you faced so much that you didn't expect.
Yes, it really, there was a barreling of all kinds of things that were unusual. Herb and I had prepared, our wills were revised, updated, I had all the powers of attorney. Herb had a massive stroke almost 20 years before. We knew he was going to die. But what came at us was a combination of two big things. COVID. Herb died on April 3rd. The world changed with COVID once the authorities realized what it was. And it was at a time when places, institutions were closing. It was also a time of ID changing. Because of privacy issues, the Social Security's number was taken off driver's licenses and off even your Medicare card. And this became a huge problem. The Herb's death certificate took 8 weeks. The banks were closed. Government offices were closed. And it was a question, first of all, how do you deal with a funeral? My husband was cremated. We had our service on Palm Sunday, on a very frigid Palm Sunday, 3 days before Passover, in our backyard. And friends came with masks. Neighbors knew they couldn't be counted in the tally, so they stood in our driveway. And since we couldn't have friends, family participate in this, and our family is spread out, my son came up with a configuration of computers and cameras. And my daughter in Falls Church, Virginia, my brother-in-law in Atlanta, Georgia, were able to give eulogies. And then overnight, Steve, and he has friends in Florida and California, who turned the video into a real video that we could send out the next day. And our daughter in Falls Church arranged for a shiva for family in the U.S. and France to participate. And that was very nice. But it wasn't quite like the wake, the Christian wake, that people come and sit with you before, or the Jewish shiva, where they come for a week afterwards. We were alone. And that was really unnerving by itself. But being told, I had just gone to the bank the day after, emptied out the safe deposit box. Because I'd read somewhere you were supposed to, fortunately, I had our most important papers, which I'd kept in the safe deposit box. And I had that with me. But when I finally heard, I called my husband's pension company and never heard from them again for 2 months until his last pension payment had been deducted electronically from our checking account. No word, no anything else. And their grief parcel apparently got lost in the mail, or so they claimed. So and then when I finally filled it out, they wanted my social security card because that was the only way they had of proving my identity. But I didn't have it. I don't have it. I took it out when I was 12 years old. And I was told, get rid of it. Don't carry it. Don't use it. And I took them for granted. I did send, because I didn't have the one going back to the 1950s, I sent them one from 1963 when I changed my name, and that wasn't acceptable to them.
Wow. And this is something, it goes back, this wasn't COVID, this was the ID that was
ID.
Trying to counteract ID fraud.
Yeah.
And so people have to be aware of that kind of thing, that they're going to need they're going to need to prove their identity.
You have to prove you were born. You have to prove you are married. It was a combination of things. And the person answering my call for the pension was working at home with a baby crying and the dog barking. And when I was turned down, I called her back. She was the only one who answered when I called their number. And I said, I want to speak to a superior. And she said, she couldn't get a hold of one. And when I was turned down the second time, I called her. She was the only one, the only filter. I want to speak to a superior. That wasn't possible. So finally, I wrote to the president of this company. And I said, is this the way you treat the spouses of your former employees? And they had trouble dealing with this pension company that they had farmed out their program to. So, and with the Social Security wanted my only wedding license.
Right.
To prove that Herb and I had been married. And that I couldn't find for 2 days. And then I looked in the stash of things I'd emptied from the safe deposit box, and it was wrapped inside the newspaper clipping of our wedding. So then I was able to collect the $255 from Social Security. But when the search for these papers, I thought, I don't even need this. I'm grieving. Why can't they leave me alone? But I had to do it to get his Social Security, which was higher than my payment, which was also frozen. Everything was frozen. I had no funds coming in except funds I had transferred on the advice of our stockbroker, who said, take out at least for 4 months.
Yes, but good advice. Right there. That's a huge lesson.
Because even that account was frozen once I had informed them. And I had property taxes, 2 trees that fell down. That had to come take. One had fallen. And I had some major expenses, plus the cremation expenses. And again, everything became frozen. And it took months to untangle this. And in those months, I was furious. I was furious that I could not sit there and grieve. I was being asked to do these things. Insurances, everything was backed up until the death certificate and being able to prove who I was. There's been so much ID fraud that they have just clamped down on this. Right. And with the pension, I write the whole correspondence in the book because people have to know what you're being asked to do. And at the end of this, and it took 4 months to get the deposits at the back and the ongoing, I asked this company my husband had worked for 4 things. Number one and number two, I wanted apologies from this company and from their farmed out benefits program. I felt I deserved that. Number three, I wanted them to change their policy, to offer options, because they told me they'd make me an exception. And I said, no, I'm not an exception. This is something you owe to the widows and widowers who are coming after me. And number four, I wanted 10 pounds of chocolate kisses, milk chocolate, that I had eaten during these 4 months of frustration.
And you wanted to refill your larder. The odd thing about that pension is that for 20 years, 2 decades, you and your husband, Herb, had been receiving that pension. So it's not like you were coming out of the blue. Same address, same name, same everything. That's what's so odd about it.
Electronically. And they debited electronically. But then they kept sending everything else by mail that got lost in the mail. So it was, but I was, they acknowledged all, but they could not give me my chocolate kisses, which I felt I deserved. So right. It was so awful that it was funny.
Yes. So who's the audience for Widowhood 101 Next Steps?
Initially, I thought it would be widows and widowers age 65 and up with comfortable savings. Mm-hmm. Because all of this, as I point out in the book, is in jeopardy. And now, and I also interviewed about 40 people, widows and widowers, for the book, because it couldn't just come from me and my reactions. But what was very important was, and I've seen now, is that people should be aware of all of this, even if they've been married 20 years, 30 years, because the policies have changed. And it's very important that you have plans. I talked to a friend of a friend who has parents 90 years old who have not made out any death requests.
Oh, wow.
Do they want to be cremated? Do they want to be buried? What kinds of things? Society is so afraid of death that by denial, they feel that they can avoid it. And it's a part of life. It's a part of living. And you need to have papers. The whole idea of where to put your papers is very important, because if I hadn't emptied out from a safe deposit box, where never kept money, I just kept important papers like a wedding license, like house title and mortgage, whatever. You need to figure out how you have these available, because houses burn down, computers die or whatever, lawyers retire and die. And where are your papers? And I talk and make recommendations for how to put this in the clouds. There are Evernote programs, things like that, where your chosen executors can share that information. And even if you're away, I interviewed one wife whose husband had everything in a loose leaf book. And it was all together. He'd been the executor for other estates, except that the loose leaf book was in Boston and he died in Florida.
Oh my.
And again, things up in the air. I've talked, a neighbor bought my book and she asked, well, what's the cloud? How do I get into the cloud? And I told her to find a 12-year-old with computers.
That's right.
That's how to do it, but where your materials will follow you. And I've run into, during my interviews, I've talked with women and men who said, well, my spouse was the one who took care of all of this. They never had to worry about it, but the spouse was the one who died.
Of course.
And so often among well-educated women, I've had, well, my husband handled all the finances. And boy, I see red with that because, again, the husband is the one who died, or the one who statistically will die. So
Right.
at first I aimed this toward widows and widowers, but I'm saying no. You need to know about these things, and you can't deny that they're going to happen. And communication between spouses or parents to children. That's part of the ebb and flow and knowing what's happening. And there are such big secrets in marriages and in families, and it's very difficult. So each of my chapters ends with the lessons that I learned. And I didn't expect that I would put grieving. I've read too many grieving books, but I felt that context was the only way to understand what came at me and what came at other people. I have friends where the husband died on a cruise and had to handle it, or people dying out of town. Very few people. I've never met anyone yet who died in their sleep, or whose spouse died in their sleep. There are all kinds of issues, and I even very bluntly talk about what grieving means and the cocoon bed and other parts of this. In
the emotional aspects.
When you have lived with a spouse and had intimacy and love, how do you sleep in a whole bed? Now, I asked friends who have been through this longer than I, and they still have 1/3 of the bed. I asked them when they change their sheets, they say, well, they don't have to change for 3 weeks. They can just move over.
Oh my goodness.
That part of it, I haven't addressed that yet, but all kinds of things. Sound. When you're used to talking with someone and suddenly the house is so quiet. Other people, and I've learned to do it myself, keep the radio or TV on, even on low. When I can't sleep at night, I turn it on. Sometimes I just have the light, but sometimes watching early morning news puts me back to sleep again. So, but different kinds of things that you wrestle with that are very difficult in adjustment. Food. The first week, I packed up all Herb's foods and I sent them over to a food bank because I didn't eat them anymore. I don't use a dishwasher. I throw out paper plates. In fact, my daughter and grandson visited over July 4th, and I'd made a very nice dinner for them, but they looked in the refrigerator, and the refrigerator was empty. And they said, we're taking you to Trader Joe's. I said, why? They said, you have no food. I said, look in the freezer, you'll see the ice cream. Look on the shelf, and you'll see Mrs. Costco's cookies.
Well, ice cream and cookies are not necessarily food.
Well, the freezer downstairs has all the soups that I used to make for her and the real food, but it's downstairs. I don't need it, except once my dog now, my Winnie, my little corgi, has decided that he loves split pea soup. So the old soups that I'd had and hadn't gotten to, he's now eating. So companion.
Winnie. Well, all this, the emotional, the practical, the financial, all of this is in your book, Widowhood 101 Next Steps. Would you say, Berenice, that this book, this handbook for people, is your service to others, that you were using your skills to help those readers through difficult times?
Yes, I would, because I looked for books like this. From the funeral director, I had a sheet. From the hospice, I had another sheet. But they were just items on the list. And I deal through the interviews, through my own experience, with some of the important elements that are coming up that new widows and widowers are going to face. And in fact, I met with a funeral director yesterday because they will probably be using my book. And I asked if he'd ever seen anything like this. He said no. And he talked about someone waiting for their husband's death certificate since November because things got lost in the mail and all these other things.
Oh, my goodness.
I mean, there are so many frustrating problems. And I will say also that with this book, it's on Amazon in Kindle for $8.95, Amazon for $9.95. I am not making any money on this. Any royalties, any whatever will be, I will donate to a food bank. It wasn't to add to the number of books I've written. It was really to say, these are coming up. They hit me between the eyes. Be prepared. And I've heard good things from some. And as I say, a neighbor looking, how does she get into the clouds? But it's a learning experience. And there are all kinds of things. And I also deal with some legal issues because I have a chapter on Attack of the Aliens. People who have been married several times have children from a previous marriage and are attacked in reading the wills with things they hadn't expected and need to be prepared for. There are a lot of things. There's a chapter on being lonely and loneliness. What happens after a death? And part of that loneliness in interviewing, and from my own experience, there are illnesses that come up pretty quickly, from COVID to all kinds of things, or falls, or whatever, that you're not braced for, that you don't expect. But, and you know, this book is anecdotal. I'm not statistically reading anything other than the numbers, the percentage of people, widows and widowers over a certain age. And it's a number to be contended with.
Right.
So
right.
I try to cover that and have quotes, but also next steps in interviewing how people I've interviewed, again, men and women, friends and friends of friends, are dealing with widowhood. Do you hold your lost spouse's photo and hide, or do you begin to come out? And even with COVID, I've talked about how different people are finding mates, dealing with it, or using friendships. But there are next steps, and these are important too.
Yes, and it's very important when people who are interested in the book search for it on Amazon to look for Widowhood 101 Next Steps, because the next steps is a key part of the title.
It is, but it isn't anymore. I have the domain name, and it's Widowhood 101.
Good.
Next Steps made it too long and too hard, but it's on Amazon, and
there's another book of a similar title, but this is your.
But they don't have a domain name, so
okay, that's good. Good for you, Berenice.
I come from a family of computer people, but it's and it's the first, it's there, and just trying to help others, and that is my training. That was my career of coming up with answers rather than problems.
Yes, and you're a very good writer. So, Widowhood 101 Next Steps, very good book, Kindle, Amazon, and it's so great that you did it and you dug deep and you put out this book, and thank you for doing that.
And I have a little dog named Winnie, who
yes, you do. Who's darling.
Yes.
So anyway, Berenice, thank you so much for your insights and your wisdom and your hard-won wisdom, actually. This is At Home Radio. Yes. Until next time, thanks for joining us.